We're going to be starting in Matthew chapter 5 in just a moment, talking about the Sermon on the Mount. But to begin, I want to make just a very quick point of clarification from this morning's sermon. Something happened this morning that really impressed me, and that really means a lot to me about the people who are here at Southside. And that is, some of you came up to me and said, "I'm not sure you're right about that." And I am so thankful that we have a relationship where if we have a conviction, we feel comfortable enough to come and talk to one another. The other thing that happened was, as the people, and it was more than one, there was a couple that came to me and said this, began telling me what they thought I wasn't right about, I began thinking, that's not what I think. And when they began telling me what they thought was right, I began thinking, I thought that's what I said. And so it became very clear to me that maybe I didn't convey one message from this morning's sermon very clearly. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 8 is a passage talking to men of the congregation, and that Paul wants them to be leading the congregation in prayer. He wants men everywhere to lift up holy hands without wrath and dissension. And I said that that is a verse talking to men, and we need to understand it that way. But I did not mean to imply that only men can raise their hands to God in prayer. And I think that utilization of a very common prayer posture in the New Testament builds upon a common prayer posture that they knew from the Old Testament in Nehemiah chapter 8, where both men and women lifted their hands in prayer. So for those of you that brought that point to me, thank you so much, because I needed to say it more clearly. And for everybody else, hopefully I haven't made you more confused by trying to deal with it right now at the beginning of this sermon. So we're going to jump into Matthew chapter 5 and talk about Jesus' Sermon on the Mount and some of the things that he's covering there. And as we get to this, we get to a portion of the Sermon on the Mount that is just not really comfortable to read. It's not our favorite part of what Jesus deals with here in verses 31 and 32 when he starts talking about marriages and specifically the divorce within marriages. So we're going to think about these passages together, and I want us to try to see them from the context that Jesus understands them when he brings it up, and the direction that he leads us in as he moves on. So for starters, let's just look at verse 31. It was said, "Whoever sends his wife away, let him give her a certificate of divorce." Matthew 5:31 begins by hearkening our attention back to the old law, specifically to Deuteronomy, and the provisions that are made there regarding divorce under the law of Moses. But we must remember that even though Jesus is leaning on the old law to bring this point about, as we've already pointed out, he is not talking about the failures of the old law. He has said several times, "I did not come to do away with the law, I came to fulfill the law." But rather, what he is calling into question is the understanding of the people that day and how they interpreted and applied the law of Moses. These are people who are repeatedly referred to as those having ears but do not hear and eyes but do not see. So whenever we read things like "you have heard" or "it was said," we should probably right away begin to understand that their perception of what they heard and what had been said is probably not accurate. And that's what we're dealing with right here. So let's begin by jumping back to Deuteronomy 24 and see what is Jesus actually talking about when he brings this up. Something that would have been so fresh in their minds because they lived this. They talked about this regularly. So Deuteronomy 24 verses 1 through 4. I'll put that on the board, but follow along in your Bibles if you like. It says, "When a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out from his house. And she leaves his house and goes and becomes another man's wife. And if the latter husband turns against her and writes a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter husband dies who took her to be his wife, then her former husband who sent her away is not allowed to take her again to be his wife, since she has been defiled. For that is an abomination before the Lord, and you shall not bring sin on the land which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance." This is what Jesus draws to their minds when he says, "You have heard, it was said that when a man divorces his wife, he must give her a certificate of divorce." To begin with this, we must look at verse 1 and recognize some things that were going on in Jesus' day. Some understandings of the statement that we find here, where it says that if she finds no favor in his eyes, or that he has found some indecency in her. Some of your translations might say some uncleanness in her. The understanding of that phrase in the days of Jesus was filled with contention. There were lots of arguments and disbelief and debates over what that means. What was Moses saying? And two very popular religious leaders, Hillel and Shammai, they started developing kind of these followings, schools of thought. And it seems like they disagreed on everything. There's very little, it seems like, that they just walked hand in hand together and said, this is the way to go. But this is one of the verses that they definitely disagreed on. Shammai insisted that for a divorce to take place, a legal cause must be found, and limited that legal cause to solely adultery, a fornication. This is the only reason why a divorce would be allowed. Hillel, instead of doing that, stressed the words, finds no favor in his eyes. He would stress those words and say divorce is allowed for any reason that displeases the husband. Maybe that language sounds familiar to us. We'll come back to that. Another rabbi around this time, a man by the name of Rabbi Akiba, said divorce is permissible if a husband finds a wife that is more appealing, or a woman that is more appealing to him than his wife. There was a lot of misunderstanding about what Deuteronomy 24 was saying. And in Matthew chapter 19, Jesus gets thrust into a conversation meant to test him with the Pharisees that reveal they, at the very least, know Hillel's viewpoint, the Hillel school of thought about if there is no favor in her eyes. So if there's any reason that displeases the husband, he can divorce her. At the very least, it details that they were familiar with that, but maybe in their language we see that they've gone even beyond that to maybe even worse things. So let's consider just two verses from that passage. Matthew chapter 19, verse 3. Some Pharisees came to Jesus testing him and asking, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all? That's that Hillel language. That's that Hillel school of thought. And Jesus gives them his answer. And they don't really like his answer, so they respond in verse 7. They say, why did Moses command to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away? I want you to think about that language for a moment. Why did Moses command? If you're in Matthew chapter 9, one of the things that you'll recognize is Jesus' use of the word allow. And that's what they are failing to see here. Their concerns, what is it that the Pharisees and the people of Jesus' day seem to be most worried about? They're worried about proper form in going through a divorce. And they're worried about that, and how do we do it the right way? And what reasons can I get away with to go through with this divorce? Instead of worrying about the causes and especially the consequences of the divorce, which Deuteronomy gives much more attention to. This caused them to misunderstand the purpose of the law. They had come to see that Moses had given them a right and a commandment. This is what you are to do, instead of making an allowance because of the hard hearts of the people, that they would be allowed to do this, but in a way that forced heavy consideration and provided great protection. I want us to begin wrapping our minds around that purpose. And to do that, we're going to look at different bookends of the Bible, especially the Old Testament, and recognize something that Jesus also draws to his listeners' minds in Matthew 19. In the days of Jesus, the Holy Scriptures, what is called by the Jews today the Tanakh, was already completed and it was closed. What you hold in your hands, while not in the same order, it would have been in a very different order, they had that. In the days of Jesus, they had Genesis through Malachi. They had those books. They studied those books. They lived off of those books. And how do those books begin? In Genesis chapter 2, they begin with man is joined to his wife. God joining man and woman together, making them one flesh, which Jesus in Matthew 19 leans upon. Says you're worried about a misunderstanding that you have in Deuteronomy 24, and you're forgetting what predated that and what is more important than that, and that is that God joined you together. You don't have a right to tear that apart. But then, as we move further through the Bible, we get to the end, the very end of God's Word in the Old Testament. We get to Malachi. And I appreciate Zach reading that for us. Malachi 2:16, in some translations, the translation he was using, sometimes places the emphasis on the hatred towards whether it be the man who is leaving his spouse, mistreating and acting treacherously and violently towards the wife of his youth. And some translations describe in Malachi 2:16 his hatred of her. But many translations go with the notion that seems to be God hates divorce. Malachi 2:16, the Lord, the God of Israel says, I hate divorce. That's another picture of textual criticism in which we look at the text and we argue and try to discover which one is most accurate, which one is trying to be brought forward by God. But if we go back in that passage, over and over again, God is looking very unfavorably on the husband who treated the wife of his youth in this way. I no longer accept with favor your offerings from your hands. The altar of the Lord is covered with tears and weeping and groaning because of how they were leaving their faithful spouses, likely because they found a reason that she found no favor in my eyes. And because of this, we are led to this conclusion. I don't want this. So why did God allow it? You don't want this. Why did you have Moses include Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 4? Why did you even put that in there? For starters, Jesus gave us that answer because of hard hearts. In Matthew 19:8, hard hearts which culminate in self-first mentality. And this is the reason for Deuteronomy 24, because when I'm looking at self-first, it's not likely that I'm going to make a decision that cares about God. And when I'm looking at self first, it's not likely that I'm going to make a decision that cares about the well-being of my spouse. But if we continue in Deuteronomy 24, what we discover is He put that in there to govern divorce. Because of hard hearts and because of people's self-will that I want to do this and I'm looking for a reason to do this, God places within His law things which are going to shape and demand certain attitudes as they move forward in that. God was governing divorce. And a couple things that we recognize in Deuteronomy 24, verse 1, they did have to have a valid and legal cause. That is very clear. Not finding favor in the husband's eyes directly connected to finding uncleanness or indecency in her. And so the law requires a legal cause. And the thing is, that legal cause may have included more than fornication. What was that indecency? What was that uncleanness? It is true that it may have allowed for more things than just fornication. But it becomes very clear in Jesus' language in Matthew chapter 5 that under the kingdom, the kingdom of God, thus is not the truth anymore. So we require a legal and valid cause under the law of Moses. And we also require a legal requirement. It makes that clear as well. That they couldn't just say, you know what, I don't like you anymore and I think I'm divorced. You know what, I don't appreciate the way that you act, or I found somebody that's more pleasing to me and I consider us divorced. He required them to go and to place a certificate of divorce in their hand, something that detailed that they had been put away from that marriage. And oftentimes would require the cause. What was the reason for this? And that was not just true for the husband that put her away. If the wife was to go and marry someone else and he decides, I'm going to divorce this woman, he is required, he has a legal requirement under the law to put a certificate of divorce in her hand. But maybe the greatest thing, we get caught up on these two a lot, and they're important, and we need to think about them. They are important things. But the greatest thing that Deuteronomy 24 brings up is that God wanted them to think long and hard about the implications of their decisions. He does not want them to make rash decisions and hasty choices, throwing themselves into divorce. He expected them to think of the consequences and how this might lead to a situation in which I'm never able to have a relationship with this woman again. I am completely breaking our relationship, and it may not ever be the same. But he also wanted to provide protection as well, to make sure that the women who were being given these certificates of divorce could not be treated as property and could not just simply be passed around. So it was said, whoever sends his wife away must give her a certificate of divorce. This was the law. And this is what they had fundamentally failed to understand as a permissive allowance governing marriages that were ending. And they had adopted the view that God was commanding us through Moses to divorce. How does Jesus deal with that? Look at verse 32 in the kingdom law that Jesus instills on this. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife except for the reason of unchastity makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So a couple things that come up right off the beginning is we see that there is a rightful cause in the kingdom. A rightful cause for the putting away of a spouse, for divorce to occur. And the only rightful cause is unchastity. And I'm reading that from the New American Standard, and I love the New American Standard, but they repeatedly fall short on translating this word, the Greek word porneia, translating it in ways that just refer to immorality, or as it says here, just some form, kind of a vague idea of unchastity. But he's speaking of sexual immorality. Fornication is the only cause by which God allows for a divorce to take place. That principle that we see here, that principle that we see here is describing a physical sexual contact outside of a husband-wife relationship. And if that is occurring, we need to pay close attention to what he is saying. If that is occurring, God has made an exception. Let me rephrase that and use language that Jesus used when he spoke to the Pharisees. If that is occurring, God allows it. We would do well to read Matthew 5:32 as this: I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife makes her commit adultery. And I know that the exception is there and the exception is important. But I have met and I have heard from pulpits and from private studies and dealing one-on-one with people, I have met and I have heard those who would just about adopt the Pharisaical mindset that you have a right and God is commanding you. In the case of unchastity, in the case of sexual immorality, to put your spouse away. Let me tell you, I know why. I know why we do that. I know why that's said. Because there is a very real reality of someone finding themselves in a situation where their life is very limited by what they can do and whether or not they can remarry again. But we must understand this passage is God making an allowance. And we must move forward with that thought, remembering God's principle hasn't changed from the beginning. I don't want divorce. Jesus reflects this as he elevates the command even more, saying that the husband who puts away his faithful wife, we're just going to call her that because there's the exception clause in the middle, so we're taking the exception clause out for a minute. She has not committed porneia, fornication. She has not lived an unchaste life. So the husband that's putting his wife away without that cause, his faithful wife, shares in her guilt in adultery. And this is reflecting the assumption that she will become remarried. And in that remarriage, she's going to be guilty of adultery, and you're going to be guilty of adultery. And at the end of the verse, the person who married her is going to be guilty of adultery. You need to think this through, is what Jesus is saying. Over and over again. It is a picture of the fulfillment of Deuteronomy 24. This is not what God wants. And if it's going to happen, it's got to happen God's way. And He wants you to think about it. But He has created these rules to cause you to think long and hard about it. All of this is said to bring up something that we've been leading towards and trying to understand throughout the course of this sermon. What is Jesus' point in saying all this? He is pointing out, He is illustrating, He is defining what kingdom citizens look like. And if that's what Jesus is doing, then in Matthew 5:31 and 32, He is calling for us to see what kingdom marriages should look like as well. And if we were to take the things that we have already seen in this, kingdom citizens are gentle and merciful and peacemakers who hunger and thirst for righteousness. They're pure in heart. They're single-minded. They have a pure focus on God. And they recognize my reward is not in this life with its persecutions and with its struggles. My reward is in heaven. And so they shine their lights in a dark world. And they don't focus on self as the world does. What is it that I want? What is it that is my right? Instead, they focus on the life of Christ, who sacrificed Himself. And they seek to pull that forward in their marriage. Kingdom marriages are about reflecting kingdom principles. Sacrificial love, purity, mercifulness and forgiveness, redemption, and reconciliation. Jesus makes this abundantly clear as He speaks about divorce during the Sermon on the Mount. And as we close, I want to address two groups from this. The first group that I want to address are those in our audience tonight, those of you who are married. Let us begin with this kingdom principle. Matthew chapter 5, verse 32. Divorce is not an option. Divorce is not for us. God has joined us together. And yes, we are going to face difficult times. And we are going to face burdens. And we're going to face trials and battles. And we will become disappointed with one another. And we will have our expectations failed to be met. But what I want to encourage you to do in the midst of this, in trying to adopt this principle on divorce, is to remember Matthew chapter 6 and verse 33. Seek God first. God is the one who brings fulfillment in our lives, including in our marriages. God is the one who meets our needs. God is the one who eases our burdens. God is the one who is able to do more than we expect, and therefore doesn't fail to meet our expectations. So let us seek Him first always, in every battle, in every difficulty. Let us seek God first, and let us seek God first for our spouses. It's very hard. It's very hard to stay angry and mad with a person that you are regularly lifting up to God in prayer, asking Him to bless them, asking Him to make them into the image of Christ, and asking God to help you be the tool that can help that process along. Let us, if we are married, have this kingdom principle. But I also want to talk to those who have been married, but that marriage ended in divorce. I want to talk to you for a moment, because this is still our kingdom principle. And if our divorce is not matching up to this, the kingdom divorce has one exception. And if our divorce was for some other cause, we need to think about that. We need to spend some time meditating about that and what that means. Maybe I have chosen to put away a spouse out of a hard heart, not for a reason that God allows for. In that case, it means seeking repentance. It means seeking to restore that which has never been separated, if that is possible. I need to work towards that. But there are also those who have been put away, or those who have went through divorces, and they've went through them for the right reasons. They went through it because of the principle that we see laid out here in Matthew chapter 5. And in those situations, it means being faithful to God and praying that maybe one day restoration could occur, but remembering who it is that is leading you through every single moment in this difficult and hard place of our life. And I would want to say to all of you as well, Matthew chapter 6, verse 33, seek God first. Seek God first and adopt His righteousness and allow Him to fulfill and provide for you, and pray for those who have dealt treacherously to you. But I think I would also like to draw your minds back to Malachi chapter 2. Malachi chapter 2 tells us that as much as we hate what has happened, or as much as we are heartbroken by the way that we have been treated and the things that have occurred by the people that we loved and the people that we trusted, as much as we may hate that, God hates it too. And He sees you. And His tears are mingled with yours. And I know that I have been guilty, and I know that it has been done before, that sermons on divorce are spoken very matter-of-factly and coldly, and this is the truth, and you are either in it or you're not. But the truth of the matter is, this topic bears the weight of the emotion of God. He is heartbroken when He sees His image created to reflect His faithfulness, created to reflect His love, His trustworthiness, His mercy, and His forgiveness. He is heartbroken when it acts unfaithfully towards Him. But no matter who you are today, married or not, I ask you to think about these things. You are not alone. Deuteronomy 31 verse 6 says, "Be strong and courageous. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or tremble at them, for the Lord your God is the one who goes with you. He will not fail you. He will not forsake you." God is leading us in battle. He's leading us in battle for our marriages. He is leading us in battle for our souls, for the souls of our children. He is leading us in battle in purity and to remain pure in our lives prior to marriage. He is leading us in battle in our examples as people who have been mistreated and people that want to glorify and honor Him. God leads us in battle. So please recognize today, you are not alone. But also I would have you turn to Joshua 24 and verse 15, which says, "If it is disagreeable in your sight to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves today whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served, which were beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose lands you are living. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." If the God of creation is standing with you in your fight for marriage, for your purity, for your example, Who is it that you are going to serve? I call on you to stop focusing on what you want or how you were treated or somebody else's failures and to start focusing on what God has done and choosing to direct yourself behind Him who was mistreated and Him who was abandoned, Him who was hurt and dealt treacherously with, violently with, crucified, and yet opened not His mouth, but gave everything for the people who were harming Him. That's the King who stands with you today with power. Serve Him. And lastly, Galatians chapter 6, verse 9. Let us not lose heart in doing good, for in due time we will reap if we do not grow weary. It is challenging work to be kingdom citizens. Anyone who says that it's easy to be a Christian has no idea what being a member of the kingdom of Christ is all about. Let me tell you, no one knows better than Jesus how hard it is. I imagine that hiking to the top of Mount Everest is really, really hard. I've not taken the first step on that journey. But there are many people who have. Many people who have got halfway or 3/4 of the way or just south of the very summit and turned back. And while they can tell you it is hard, they cannot tell you how hard it is to hike Mount Everest because they've never truly done it. They've never finished the hike. When I tell you it's hard to be a kingdom citizen, I speak as someone that set my mind to live that life and failed repeatedly. But Jesus speaks to us as one who accomplished it, who has made it to the top. And not only does He understand how difficult it is to stand apart and to stand devoted to God in a fallen and dark world, He knows better than any of us where it leads to. He knows the end. And He calls us to see that. He calls for us to recognize what is in front of us. And throughout His Word, the Spirit urges again and again. You fall, you stumble, ask for forgiveness, get back up, press on, finish the fight, run the race. Over and over again, what are we being told? By the Spirit of God, we're being told, don't give up. It is worth it to continue. So today, if you feel like giving up, let's talk about that. Let's spend time together. You and me, the elders, would be happy to talk and to help you as you try to navigate through the problems that are going on in your life, in your marriages. Don't give up. But if you're here today and you feel like, I've already given up, what do I do now? We need to talk about that too. For sure, we need to talk about that. And if that is easier for you to schedule that sometime after services this week, the elders are meeting. I'll get the date wrong if I say it, but the elders are going to announce that date in just a moment. We're meeting. Bring the problems that you're dealing with to them. And let's talk about that. And let's begin moving again today. And lastly, I want to ask you to think about if you've never put on Christ in baptism. The relationship of a Christian to Christ is described as marriage. It's described as a holy covenant, one in which God swears, makes an oath, He vows that He will not break. He will be faithful to. And maybe you are here today and you have not entered into that relationship with our King. And maybe you are here today because you've seen people who have entered into that relationship and have not acted faithful to the God that they have been wed to. Or you are here today and you have seen people in our marriages that have not acted faithful to the way that God has made us. What I want you to know is they are going to be held accountable for that. But you are going to be held accountable too for the decisions that you make. And I encourage you, before it is too late, make a decision today to belong to God. In whatever way that we can assist you this evening, please come forward and let's talk about that together as we stand and as we sing.